Hey, and welcome into FT Monthly. I'm Josh Klein, your host. We are a podcast of FreeThinking Ministries that seeks to equip the church to engage with the culture by applying good theology to everything. And it's so good to have you. I hope you had a good January, a beneficial January. I know I did. I was able to go up to Canada, of all places, and be able to talk a little bit with people up there about what it means to live in a post-Christian context as a Christian and how we ought to be able to have conversations about that. It was just a great opportunity to be up there. Really enjoyed the people. It was fun, and I was able to make it back to the States. It was cold, but it wasn't much warmer here in Omaha either while I was out there. So I guess that's a win. I don't know. On this month's FT Monthly, we're going to be looking at something a little bit different. Normally we do 3 topics and then a main thing, but this month it's pretty much going to be all a main thing. Now, last month I looked a little bit at critical theory and just a little bit in relation to a response to a Facebook post that I made about the dance company that I interviewed last month as well. If you haven't seen that interview, you can see the interview in its entirety. I'll clip it below in the comments section or in the description here below, and please check that out. It's a great opportunity for people to hear the gospel. But I digress. The point of that was to point out the way people are thinking, especially about critical theory and critical race theory. And it's a difficult concept to talk about in small shots and small periods of time. But it is one of the things that I get asked most about when we talk about how to interact with our current culture. Beyond LGBTQ issues, to talk about those a lot, this is probably the second most common topic that I get asked about, which is great, but it can be difficult to engage with. And that's why I'm bringing on, and I'm so excited to do this because it's a very important book, 2 authors, Dr. Pat Sawyer and Dr. Neil Shenvi, that wrote a book called Critical Dilemma. And that is going to be the interview here today. I encourage you, listen to the interview if you're interested at all in critical theory, what it means, critical race theory, how to interact with it. A lot to cover in this interview, but also get the book. Get the book and read the book because it's going to help you discern and be able to understand a lot of things. That and not much more on this month's FT Monthly. Critical Dilemma, The Rise of Critical Theories in Social Justice Ideology, Implications for the Church and Society. It's a great book. Excited to talk about that today. But I'm not just going to talk about it. I'm going to bring both Dr. Neil Shenvi and Dr. Pat Sawyer on here today. Dr. Shenvi has a degree in chemistry from Princeton and a PhD in theoretical chemistry from UC Berkeley. He's also the author of Why Believe, A Reasoned Approach to Christianity, and is widely recognized for his writing on critical theory, which can be found in journals like Icon and the Journal for Christian Legal Thought. And Dr. Pat Sawyer has a BA in psychology from UNC Chapel Hill, an MA in communication studies from UNC Greensboro, and a PhD in educational studies and cultural studies from UNC Greensboro. And he is also published in the Academy and in various popular outlets as well. So I want to bring on Dr. Sawyer and Dr. Shenvi right now. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us here today.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so like I was saying, one of the things that I get requested to talk about when I go to churches and stuff like that is critical theory. And generally speaking, I try to point them to resources and say, a 20-minute talk on this is not going to do it justice. It's probably the second most requested thing after LGBTQ plus issues. And I have enjoyed reading a lot of secular pushback on it, cynical theories by James Lindsay, and then some Christian ones as well. Fault Lines by Fadi Bakum, Fire in the Streets by Dr. Groteis. And while I enjoyed those books for what they were, I felt that they severely lacked in being able to actually engage critical theory and critical race theory for what it is and historically what it has been. And so, Dr. Shenvi, when I saw you put on Twitter, and I've been following you for quite some time and have enjoyed ShenviApologetics.com. In fact, one of my favorite articles is actually about James Cone's work on your site as well. So thank you for your work there. But as I was saying, so I saw you were writing a book called Critical Dilemma and couldn't wait to get my hands on it. My wife bought it for me for Christmas. So good wife, right? And I was able to reach out and have you guys come on. So once again, thank you for joining me. Well, why don't we start here, guys? Let's get to a definition of what critical theory is. I know you call it contemporary critical theory in your book, but let's get to a definition of what you're talking about when you talk about those sorts of things.
Sure, it's a good thing to start with is defining your terms. So critical theory is an umbrella category today. It goes back to the writings of Karl Marx. Then later at the Frankfurt School, they coined the term critical theory. But since then, that was 80, 90 years ago, since then, the category has evolved and spawned entire new disciplines. So things like critical race theory, queer theory, critical pedagogy, post-colonial theory, these are all today various critical social theories that would fall within that umbrella category of critical theory writ large. And in our book, you're right, we coin a new phrase, contemporary critical theory, to sort of identify the four core ideas that connect all of these sub-disciplines within the critical tradition. So those four ideas are the social binary, hegemonic power, lived experience, and social justice. So just in one sentence each, the social binary refers to the way the critical theorists think society is divided between oppressor groups and oppressed groups along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, age, and a host of other factors. Then how is that oppression taking place today in modern Western liberal societies? It's not happening through overt cruelty and injustice and tyranny. They would say, no, it's rather happening through what's called hegemonic power, the second idea. So they would say that in every society, the ruling class, whether it's whites, men, heterosexuals, Christians, the able-bodied, they impose their ideas about race, their norms, their values, their standards. They impose those standards on culture in a way that appears to us natural, objective, neutral, even God ordained. But those values actually privilege and advance the agenda of the ruling class. Again, whether it's whites, men, heterosexuals, Christians. So that's how oppression takes place. And then all of us are socialized into those systems of white supremacy, patriarchy, heterosexism, cisgenderism, ableism. So how do we see through that? How do we see that these supposedly neutral objective values are actually mechanisms for oppression? Well, that's through the third idea, lived experience. So oppressed groups, whether it's women or people of color, LGBTQ people, disabled people, they can see the way in which the ruling class has imposed their values on culture. And then that gives them the authority to speak about their lived experience and to lead the rest of us who are blinded by our privilege out of our oppression. And that's the end goal. The fourth idea of contemporary critical theory is that we're working towards social justice, which to them means the elimination of all forms of social oppression and the dismantling of systems and structures that perpetuate these oppressions. So in a nutshell, that's what unifies all these various critical theories today, whether it's critical race theory, queer theory, post-colonial theory, or whatever.
All right, thank you. Dr. Sawyer, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, I would just reinforce that critical theory is about power, how power is manifested in society, particularly in our social systems and institutions. And some people are left outside of that power, outside of the status quo. And those people are marginalized and disenfranchised. And critical theory, based upon its own prescription and ideas and beliefs and pre-commitments and prescription for the world, is attempting to empower those who have been disempowered, to give power to those who have been marginalized. And that's really the campaign, and that dovetails into what Neil was saying in terms of the social justice perspective of critical social theory. And again, that power, primarily the concern from the critical social theorist, is how that power is located in institutions and societal systems, not so much on the individual level and not, as Neil mentioned, having to do with coercive or violent power, thinking of hegemonic power, dominant power manifested in cultural systems and norms and so forth. And I would just say that, as Karl Marx is really that first that first critical theorist. The Frankfurt School in the 1920s and 30s is where the term critical theory came about. And the Frankfurt School was an extension and an expansion and an amendment to Marxism, both an extension and an amendment to Marxism. Critical social theory that we see today manifested in a number of critical social theories, like Neil mentioned, critical pedagogy, critical race theory, postcolonialism, queer theory. Critical social theory today is really an extension and an amendment to historic critical theory. And so that kind of gives kind of a through line in terms of how we've landed in terms of where we are now. In that convention of contemporary critical theory that we have, these four ideas that Neil mentioned do permeate all of these critical social theories, but we do want to underscore that that's not all that they talk about. We're not trying to truncate it in a way. We just are labeling it contemporary critical theory because these are the ideas that are having the most stranglehold on our society today. It's our current zeitgeist. And these ideas are really impacting the church. So that's why Neil and I have isolated them.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I kind of want to rewind a little bit because like we said initially, I want to go to a quote you have in your book. On page 34, you say, too often books that oppose wokeness are long on criticism but short on scholarship. I really resonate with that. Like I said before, I appreciated those other works for what they were, but I did find that to be the case. Was that the impetus for why you guys put the effort into compiling this, where you kind of like, someone needs to do it, it might as well be us?
Yeah, we've been speaking and talking about this stuff, writing about it for about 5 or 6 years now, Pat. And we were hoping, we naively assumed that the church would get its act together. You know, once we kind of showed people what was wrong with these ideas, it would blow over and be a fad. The church at least would say, "Oh yeah, this is unbiblical." Well, that didn't happen. And Pat, in like 2018 was it? Pat was already saying, "You know, we got to write a book." So it took a while. Now, why was it written the way we did it? We did want to write a book that was scholarly. It was clearly academic. Now it's accessible. I've been told by readers that yes, it's clearly scholarly and academic, but it's also readable. You don't have to be a PhD or even a college graduate to read this. You know, my son's a freshman in high school, and he can read it and understand it and appreciate it. So.
He's exceptionally sharp, though. Jim.
Well, he's a precocious freshman in high school, but nonetheless, we want it to be both a high level scholarship and also accessible to a layperson. But why? Yeah, I do think one of the main motivations was not so much the superficiality of other treatments. I don't think that's the main thing. The main reason actually was the pushback that other books got. I think in general, these books, some that you named, and there are others you could mention, like John McWhorter's Woke Racism, and I'm into have a whole bookshelf of these books. I mainly read critical theorists, but I occasionally will read the other side. But they would get pushback from, frankly, woke people with the most not very relevant objection sometimes. These books were often, they were right over the target in terms of what they were trying to say, but they didn't cite the right people or not enough people, or they're cherry picking their sources or whatever, on and on and on. And we got fed up with it. And so we just said, we're going to write this bulletproof text that no one will be able to claim that it is superficial, that it's not really understanding these theories, that it's not letting them speak for themselves. So our book has 770 plus footnotes. We cite around 200 primary source texts. We don't just reference them in passing. We have block quotes, thousands of words of primary source quotes. So we show our work. We're not just telling you what these theorists believe. We're letting them speak for themselves. And, and it's it is a long book, and it would be 3 times as long if I let Pat, took the reins off Pat. He wanted to have 8 million footnotes and 1,000 sources, but we have, I think, I'm glad that you appreciated the level of scholarship because we really tried to make it bulletproof.
Yeah, I did really appreciate that. And one of the critiques, and I love Dr. Grossice's book, but one of the critiques, I wrote a review for it on FreeThinking Ministries. One of the critiques I had was that he didn't quote Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Gene Stefanik, Richard Delgado. He didn't really quote them at length. And it felt like he hit the target, but like you said, it seems like the target often is moving, and so when you're able to actually say, well, I'm still manning this position. I'm not creating a caricature. I really appreciated that about that.
One thing I mentioned,
yeah,
one thing I mentioned, Josh, is that we basically have 4 chapters of explication of critical social theory. Then we have other chapters that are critique. And so we have over 200 primary sources, scholarly sources relative to critical social theory. So if you think about a peer-reviewed journal article today, you're going to have 50 to 60 other peer-reviewed articles supporting that article. And so in our minds, on some level, we were thinking we would hit 50 to 60, scholarly sources, books, or journal articles to go with those 4 chapters of explication. And then, as Neil mentioned, we are not just barely referencing them. We are in them, working in them, engaging them. We're not just taking, page 2 and a brief phrase. We're really invested in the sources, demonstrating that we're reading all the material in the sources, not just cherry picking. And then we also have drawn content across critical social theory. So we didn't just silo to critical race theory and load everything into that. So we delve into queer theory, feminist theory, critical pedagogy, post-colonialism, critical race theory. So we're demonstrating that a broad understanding of the knowledge area to try to reinforce that we're not making things up, that we absolutely are still manning what the opponents to what we're saying, we're offering something that's not a straw man. It's something that is really thorough and a strong perspective and iteration of what they're offering. You want to present your opponent's argument in the best light, and that's what we tried to do. And in fact, as Neil and I this was some pushback from the publisher. They were saying, hey, wait a minute, these first chapters are kind of convincing, and are you going to critique anything? Not convincing that they were thinking about becoming a top shelf critical theorist, but that they were seeing that, wow, you're not offering any critique, and so you're really carrying the reader along. And will that cause some readers to begin to engage the knowledge area uncritically? But that was part of our approach, because we wanted to represent things fairly, and certainly the critique comes later.
Yeah, it absolutely does. That was one of the things I noticed too in the first 4 chapters. I said, "Oh man, these guys are really doing a good job of demonstrating in a way that it's believable." Because sometimes I think when we critique things, we tend to try to make it as unbelievable as possible before we even critique it, so that everyone, people jump on, they pile on and say, "Yeah, that's dumb," or "That's stupid." But this way, you can kind of get the perspective of where people are coming from, whether or not it's right or wrong, to say this is their perspective. And then when you critique that perspective, I think it's even more powerful. So yeah, really, really appreciate that. One of the things that you do is you dive a little bit into American history. I'm going to read another quote here. It says, Christians and non-Christians alike who recognize the dangers of contemporary critical theory need to demonstrate their acute awareness of our nation's racial history and other contemporary social problems. And I appreciated that. I appreciated your treatment of American history. One of the frustrations that I've had when reading certain books, I read a book called God and Race by John Siebling and Wayne Francis. It's a pretty good book. It's more pastoral than anything, but they try to dive into American history, and where they really settle on is something like the 3/5 compromise. And I feel like sometimes, as you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as Christians, we want to give a nod to the fact that America has an awful racial past. And we do that by pointing to things like the 3/5 compromise when we don't actually understand the historical context of what the 3/5 compromise was. But you guys chose to not go that direction and went to Plessy versus Ferguson, which to me seems to be a better indicator of the past racial injustice. Was this intentional? Did you leave out the 3/5 compromise intentionally because people talk about that a lot, and you wanted to go to something more robust and convincing to the reader? That's a personal inquiry on my own.
We didn't leave it out intentionally. In fact, in our notes, that was part of our notes, and potentially including that. And we would, that 3/5 compromise, that was in an attempt to determine the number of seats in the House of Representatives, from the Constitutional Convention in, 1787. We do view that as egregious, this notion that black bodies and slaves are really being viewed as commodities here, and the slave states wanting to get 100% representation of those slaves to get power, to get seats into the House, but yet there's no voting rights for those slaves and no agency and no opportunity. And so you can see how it would make sense that the northern states, or the free states, are saying, well, no, they shouldn't get any credit at all as human beings because they don't have any voting rights or agency. But yet, look at what we're doing there. We're saying these human beings have no dignity, no humanity whatsoever because they're slaves. And so on both fronts, the North and the South, it's terrible. And we do view the 3/5 compromise as horrendous. But we were writing a 500-page book, not an 800-page book. Neil's already mentioned I have about 400 extra critical social theory sources in my notes dispersed around. And so we had to land somewhere. And so when it came down to giving some of the history of our racialized past, we had to pick our spots. Hopefully, Josh, we covered a number of things that will at least get people thinking and give them opportunities to investigate further our sordid history relative to race.
Yeah. Neil, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, people would ask us, well, why don't we continue talking about racial injustice after we kind of stopped with Jim Crow? That's not entirely true. In chapter 7, we have a discussion of modern day racial discrimination. I guess, like Pat said, they're an infinite. There are a large number of topics we could have hit. We had to just pick and choose. And I do think through its compromise, occasionally people do. I think they misread that because I think they think the South was the one trying to get the slaves counted as not humans, and the North was counting them as. But that's not. It was backwards. South fully wanted them counting towards their full representation, and the North was the one saying no, trying to deprive them of power. But that just shows that people will often believe these narratives they're told about history without actually looking into it. Well, what was really going on in the 3/5 compromise? And we try to pick out, like I said, Plessy versus Ferguson, and the Jim Crow laws and lynching, these major episodes or periods in our history that showed how deeply embedded in our government and our culture were racist ideas. And that's a fact. It's a historical fact. We don't have to pretend that's not the case. I think we want to emphasize, well, but today it's different. It is. Doesn't mean it was different yesterday. So we can be honest about that and say, hey, yeah, we committed a great sin as a nation, and we have to acknowledge that, along with acknowledging that we're no longer in that same situation today.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And along with the 3/5 compromise, one of the reasons I actually appreciated you guys leaving it out of the book is I actually think it can be a distraction when you have the conversation, because there's so much to understand around why the northern states wanted it that way, whether or not some people think it's the northern states' ploy to make slavery illegal in the future. That sort of thing. And so it can be we distract from the main thing. We have a racial past that is awful, and we need to, if we're going to have any conversation, we need to actually recognize that. So, thank you for that. That's a note of personal interest for me. I don't know if the viewers will find it as interesting, but I really appreciate your answers on that.
And Josh, you make a good point. A lot of people do get it reversed, and they have it just wrong in their mind. And so you have to spend some time kind of explaining quite a bit to even deal with it. So, but that didn't necessarily disenchant us from discussing it. Again, we were covering a number of things already.
Yeah, I was impressed by the breadth of things that you covered in a book. I know 500 pages seems like a lot, but there was quite the breadth of content: historical, philosophical, sociological, political content that you were able to get together in 500 pages. So I think it's really well done. In your book, you have 15. So we're going to shift a little bit here. We're going to get to critical race theory. That's kind of the buzz term. That's what everyone wants to do. I think you have to wait till, is it chapter? I'm trying to remember, chapter 8. I can't remember. You have to wait till about halfway through the book before a critique of critical race theory even.
We talk about it in chapter 5. We explain it in we critique it in chapter 8. So that's right. If you're ready to get to the critique, you can skip ahead, I guess.
Yeah. But I think you need to read chapter 5 in order to read chapter 8 for sure.
Chapter 10.
Oh, chapter 10. That's what it is. Okay. But in your book in chapter 5, you point to 15 primary tenets of critical race theory. What are some of the most notable ones? They're all important, but what are some of the most notable ones that people need to be aware of?
So we condense it down into 4 big ideas. And it's true that if you look at the literature, there's no like 10 commandments of critical race theory. Some sources list 6, some 5, some 7. Pat wanted to be comprehensive and just cast a really broad net, all the possible things people have listed as the core tenets. And so we have these like 15, and there are other ones too you could even list in there. But they're all can be organized around these 4 ideas. The first idea is racism is normal, permanent, and pervasive. Second, racism is concealed beneath ideas like color, blindness, meritocracy, objectivity, neutrality. Third, that lived experience is the best way to understand racism. And then fourth, that racism is one of many interlocking systems of oppression. So again, briefly, racism is normal, permanent, and pervasive. Critical race theorists reject the idea that racism is primarily about individual racial prejudice or animus. They view racism not as primarily about your own personal attitudes towards other people. It's a system that is deeply embedded in American society today, a system that advantages whites at the expense of people of color. 2, then people say, well, where is this system? Like, which law? I often have conservatives ask, well, which laws are the racist ones? Let's get rid of those laws. Point me to the racist thing that the U.S. is doing, and we'll stop doing that. Well, this is where their second idea comes in, which is that racism is concealed beneath ideas like color blindness. So they would view procedurally colorblind policies, claims about objectivity in hiring, merit-based hiring, merit-based promotions, all of these ostensibly race-neutral qualifications, policies, norms, values. They're actually mechanisms by which the ruling class, that is white, preserve their power. They keep people of color out of positions of power and authority. They have disparate impact on people of color. That's what racism is, and it portrays itself as neutral and fine and objective, but it's actually not. It goes back to the idea of critical theory itself. That hegemonic discourses cover up, they mask the way that they function to promote the power structure of the status quo. And then, well, how do you see through that? Again, lived experience. You see how now the conservatives of critical theory broadly dovetail with critical race theory. We understand how racism works by asking people of color how it works. Their experiences allow them to see the reality of racial oppression in a way that whites are blind to because of their privilege. And finally, this is a big idea, intersectionality. It says that racism is one of many interlocking systems of oppression, along with sexism, heterosexism, ableism, and so forth, which means that it has to be dismantled simultaneously with those other systems. So Ibram X. Kendi will say flatly that if you want to be an anti-racist, you must be a feminist, you must be anti-capitalist, you must reject homophobia and transphobia if you really want to be an anti-racist, because these are all interlocking systems of oppression. And he says in very openly that he's indebted to Kimberly Crenshaw for these ideas. She's a critical race theorist who invented the term intersectionality. So that's a brief overview of the sort of the 4 central claims or ideas within this broader critical race theory movement.
And Josh, I would just mention that those 4 ideas are taking into account several tenets, under each one. We have 15 tenets listed, and each of those tenets that we have listed have been named as a tenet in the scholarship. Okay. Now, oftentimes when papers are being written, 2 or 3 tenets are collapsed together, and really form kind of a big idea relative to critical race theory. And that's what we've also done in our book. So we provide both of those things. I did want to mention a tenet and then also demonstrate how it's problematic in a way to think about the tenet in the way that critical race theory thinks about it. One of those tenets is this idea that whiteness is property, that being white is property. And what CRT means by that is that if you're white or if you perform whiteness, you will receive a certain amount of cultural capital in society in terms of resources relative to money and then also resources relative to just cultural power, your ability to get along in the world, various privileges and benefits that come along with being white. And so let's think about that for a second. If we're in the United States in 1812, well, absolutely, whiteness is property, it is power, it is cultural power. And if we are in 1912, well, it's still a lot of cultural power connected to being white, but it is not identical from 1812 to 1912. And then when we fast forward to 2012, well, we are living in the United States in a white majoritarian culture. So there is iterations and aspects of white privilege that exist in 2012, but it is nowhere near what would be manifesting in society in 1812 and 1912. And then also by the time we're in 2012, we are having cultural power connected to majoritarianism in a way that is not so rooted in skin color or racist contextualization of people in society. And the notion that the amount of cultural capital has stayed the same or remained constant or remained at a very high threshold is absurd. But critical race theory doesn't want to acknowledge the fluidity of that dynamic and that reality. And oftentimes you're talking to someone who is bought into critical race theory, and they're talking about white people and black people and how they're intersecting and how they're relating to one another as if it's 1912, as if Jim Crow was still operative. And this is one of the great flaws of critical social theory. It wants to, in a sense, essentialize certain time periods, carry that forward, and act as if the same type of social dynamics are still in play. But that's not the case at all. And a proper social theory will take into account the movements and changes that are taking place in society, and how race is manifested and ethnicity is manifested in our society is tremendously fluid. And in fact, you can have cultural capital if you are non-white, if you're black in certain spaces, or if men are considered oppressive underneath that social binary, but women have cultural capital in certain spaces. And so, for instance, there are areas in our society where localized hegemonic power is actually working against being male, heterosexual, and white. But critical social theory and then critical race theory along the lines of race doesn't often take into account those fluid changes that are taking place in society. And this is one of the things that Neil and I want to remind everybody of.
That's good. That's good. Does it also, is that also, let's see the way I'm trying to word this. Does it also play into how people who adhere to critical theory and critical race theory read history, read people in the past, like tearing down statues of George Washington, things of that nature, that they're reading into the past a value system rather than understanding that fluidity throughout history? Is that a similar dynamic?
I would say that certainly critical race theory looks at history from an ahistorical standpoint. There's a sense in which critical race theory wants to challenge and problematize how history has come to us. And history is often given to us by people who have power, in a sense, dictating and telling us what that history was, emphasizing certain things, de-emphasizing others in relationship to how it serves their interest. So there's some truth to that truth to that idea, but critical race theory really wants to take things a step further in terms of how it wants to rewrite history in a sense, and then emphasize the non-white contributions in a way that might be too aggressive in terms of what the reality was on the ground. But yet, some of that campaign is good because Black voice and Black contribution has been so tremendously, egregiously muted. Now, with what you're specifically getting at, yes, critical race theory is not predisposed to taking the nuances and the complexities of history on the ground in the moment into account. That is not the first order of business when it comes to critical race theory. So if we're thinking about a monument that has been constructed and erected at a certain period of time relative to a certain individual, if that individual has any connection whatsoever to something racist, then critical race theory would be of the mind to just take the monument down. Never mind that 98% of that individual may have been doing things that were exceedingly good, genuinely so, intrinsically so, for society and the community, and even from the standpoint of God and Christian perspective, that's not going to be relevant to the strong critical social theorists. We just need to take those monuments down. So you are getting at something. Sometimes the understanding the nuances of history, the intricacies of history that would actually maybe lead us to make a different decision about what we do with the monument or not is not something that's the first charge of critical social theory.
It's good. It's good. Well, in light of all of that, I think it's a good transition into part 2 of your book. You offer a Christian critique of critical theory and critical race theory in particular. And I want to say I really appreciated that because there's a lot of scripture that's used. And I haven't seen, and perhaps I haven't read the right books, but I haven't seen other books take that tact to say, this is exactly why critical theory and critical race theory is not just at odds with the Bible, but fundamentally unbiblical or even anti-biblical in some sense. So what are some of the core points that you make as far as that critique from a biblical and Christian perspective?
So yeah, we do try to lean very heavily on scripture and to connect the dots for people, because again, we've seen the pushback in hindsight against a lot of the anti-woke discourse that say, well, you're strawmanning these ideas, number one, but number two, that's not really anti-biblical. That might be against your own personal white Western male interpretation of the Bible, but it's not against the Bible itself, because the Bible is all about liberation, say. But then that pushback is not often very specific. It doesn't say, well, this verse says you're wrong. It's just this vague, well, the Bible is all about liberation. And so we wanted to get into the text and to say, well, no, this text should be exegeted this way, and this text and these texts and these 10 texts, they all imply this statement is false. So people couldn't wiggle out this vague hand waving and say, no, somehow it all works out. It doesn't. So let me give you some examples. And some of them are very macro concerns. Some of them are very narrow concerns. On a macro level, we point out that critical theory today, contemporary critical theory, functions as a worldview for many people. It's a way that they're viewing all of reality. It's giving them meaning and purpose. It's giving them a set of heroes and villains. It gives them a set of moral duties. So it's really the lens through which they see everything. And our point is that the lens through which they're viewing the world is not compatible with the biblical lens. For example, in terms of how we think about identity, the social binary says we could divide it into oppressors and oppressed along lines of race, class, gender, etc. Well, Christianity says no, the primary lens with which you're to view human beings is that we're united in the imago Dei, we're united in our rebellion against God, we're all sinners, then we're united through Christ, that we're brought into union with Christ in the church, at least, certainly not outside the church. So if you do that, so then of course you can still belong to certain identity groups, whether male or female, or black or white, or Hispanic or Asian, or Cubs fans and 49ers fans, whatever it is. but our primary identity has to be rooted in Christ, and in other, and for non-Christians, in the Imago Dei, we treat people primarily as fellow image bearers before we view them as a member of any demographic group. Well, that's a fundamental issue, and we're seeing it have practical implications for, say, the church. You can't walk into church on Sunday and look around and see oppressor and oppressed Christians. No, absolutely not. And we can quote Ephesians, Galatians, Colossians, all these texts that say that show us that God wants us to view each other not from a worldly perspective, but through the lens of our identity in Christ. Another example, and this is just seems so obvious, I have to spell it out. Critical theory problematizes hegemonic narratives, these singular sets of values and norms that the ruling class imposes on everybody else to justify their power and authority. They see that as oppressive. The Bible itself, though, is a hegemonic narrative. It's a story about how God deserves all honor, praise, and authority. It justifies his rule over us and his sovereignty over us. And so critical theory will tend to problematize that and see God's laws and rules as oppressive. Or at the very least, they will say, well, that's not really God. That's your white male interpretation of God. But no matter what tradition you approach the Bible from, it's going to come away saying, no, God really is sovereign. He really gives us commands that we should follow transculturally. This isn't oppressive. And practically, it means the gender binary, male and female, is not an oppressive social construct. It's God ordained. Sexual ethics, prohibitions against homosexuality in the Bible, are not culturally bound. They are God ordained. They're universal. So it's not just these sort of guiding ideological principles. It's on the ground, has application for how we view all kinds of things in our daily lives. And I'll give just one more, the idea that lived experiences valorize, that we have to center these marginalized voices. They have social insight into social reality. That's often used to justify wrong interpretations of the Bible. And people sometimes hear that and even gasp, like, you can't say a biblical interpretation is wrong. Well, yes, I can, because some are wrong. If I interpret John 3:16 to mean that, like, there's some crackers in my pantry, that's what the text means. How do you know that? Well, I'm a half Indian male, and I just know in my heart from my lived experience that that's what the verse means. That's not true. It's a wrong interpretation. So no matter how uncomfortable you are with saying, well, some interpretations are objectively true and others are false, you have to say that. Everybody says that at some point. We draw the line somewhere, and we can't allow people to stand on their own identities or anything else, their own feelings or even their own education level, and say, well, I have a PhD, therefore I'm right. None of that matters. The text objectively means what it objectively means. We can certainly ask, well, how have my own personal biases, how has my social location influenced my interpretation? But in no sense does that determine my interpretation of the text. God's text says what it says. We should all be seeking the objective meaning of that text, and then questioning ourselves and each other and trying to figure out what the best. But in the end of the day, there is one right answer, just like there is in other fields of study, and we have to be aiming towards that rather than deferring to people's this is their interpretation is fine because that's their African interpretation of the text. I have my European interpretation of the text. You have your American interpretation. We can't do that. We want to say, what does God say in his word, and then stick to that.
Yeah, that's great. Dr. Sawyer, do you have anything to add to that, or are you?
Well, I think it also goes to this notion that critical social theory is highly interested in notions of brown theology, black theology, white theology, and this idea that there's a range of theologies that are rooted into social location or ethnic location or so forth, and that kind of interpretation. And critical social theory does a sleight of hand in a way. It wants to indicate that all these different theologies are somewhat legitimate. They're legitimate options, but yet then it wants to condemn white theology perspective. So yet on one hand, we want a broad understanding of theology that is rooted in social or ethnic location and legitimize a range of theologies, which is false, because there's no such thing in truth relative to black theology or white theology or brown theology. So that's a false premise to begin with. But then it wants to then challenge, problematize, and condemn white theology, European theology. And there are calls to decolonize your theology. Well, there aren't calls to decolonize Black theology. There's not calls to decolonize Hispanic or brown theology or any type of Latinx theology. It's just one direction, white theology. But it's a game on all sides. and so we are trying to pull the cover off that con in a way, and then get us back down to proper exegetical perspective around the Bible, and not just have this free-for-all of eisegesis that essentially is taking place. And
let me just say too, it's fine if you want to just label certain schools of thought. Well, that's Scottish theology or Black theology or what, sure, whatever you want. But at the end of the day, the question is what's the true theology?
Yeah.
You can label these doctrines, this is Calvinist theology, Arminian theology, but then what's actually said in the Bible is the ultimate question. And when people gasp, they're like, well, how can you denigrate Black theology or Latinx theology? I just want to ask them, well, why don't we have Black mathematics and Latinx mathematics and white mathematics? And the answer is, well, that's true or false. Exactly. That's our whole point. There is a true and false theology, and we want to find that. Again, we're not about labels. We're not saying, oh, don't even call any theology Black. No, I get that. Scottish theology. But at the end of the day, what determines which is true? And the answer is whether it corresponds to what the Bible teaches, not about who promotes it.
Yeah, that's great. And that's great for Neil to mention that, because I wouldn't want to give an indication that it's necessarily wrong to label something that way. But the point is what underneath that label, is it biblically true? And that's where we get into some singular understanding. Interpretation is singular or maybe double, depending on what kind of prophecy we might be dealing with. Application is many, but not interpretation. But critical social theory pushes this theological perspective that there's ranges of different kinds of interpretations siloed to how we're labeling this theology. And whereas we would say, well, sure, it's fine to say, Calvinistic theology, but what's really important is that Calvinistic theology true, biblical, accurate. That's the point. And so we do try to unpack some of that in the book.
Yeah, and I think it's like you said, it's very dangerous, and I think we're seeing it start to change the way young evangelical Christians are actually thinking about the gospel. I remember a Barna study saying that 60% of self-prescribed evangelical Christians between the ages of 18 and 40 say that Jesus is not the only way to salvation. And I think this idea that we need to center other perspectives and other voices, and I think even in your book you talk about how evangelism is seen as oppression in many respects, because you are now, and I've seen progressive Christians say the same thing. Oh, we shouldn't evangelize because it's oppressing that people group, and that all lends itself to thinking, well, there must be many roads to the same location, but that's just not what we find in Scripture. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through Him. And so, highlighting that, super important. I enjoyed that chapter. Of all of the chapters in the book, I thought that one was one of the most enjoyable. I do want to touch on something real quick, if you have a little bit more time. You mentioned the labels and what's underneath it. You say early in your book that you're not trying to label things. You want to talk about ideas. Why is it so important for Christians to start to recognize that needs to be the tactic that we use when we're talking about the way people think? Or because I don't know if you guys are aware, we live in a very tumultuous political time. And so we like to throw out labels and then argue against the labels, but you hammer down on the ideas behind them. Why do you see that as the most important thing, as you started your book with it?
So two reasons. One is that we keep hearing people say, well, I can't be doing critical race theory. I've never even heard the term critical race theory until about a year ago. And the answer is, well, that's just not true, though, because you're espousing the ideas, not knowing even where they come from. Because we get critical race theory everywhere today. You open up a magazine, watch an advertisement, watch a movie, hear a song. It's everywhere. So you don't have to have read Delgado or Crenshaw or Bell to to know deep in your bones how to think properly about race. It's just everywhere. That's one reason. The other reason is that people that are actually doing critical race theory knowingly, consciously, if you just firebomb the term critical race theory without explaining it, they'll just change the label. So if you critique critical race theory, they'll say, well, we're not doing that. We're doing anti-racism. And if you say, well, I'm against anti-racism too, they'll say, well, we're doing critical whiteness pedagogy though. And it'll just keep changing. So you have to identify and attack the ideas so that they can't just swap out a new term.
Yeah, and I see this a lot actually, even with the term Christian nationalism, that there are certain people that mean different things when they say Christian nationalism. There are abhorrent views of Christian nationalism, and then there are what I would consider just historic views of what it meant to be a Christian in a nation. But so if we're not hammering down to, well, what are the ideas behind what you're saying, you can just, well, I'm not a Christian nationalist, or it can go the other way. They would say, well, you are a Christian nationalist. You say, well, no, I'm not. It's like, oh, you're a white Christian nationalist. And the response is, well, you put another modifier on there. It's a little bit different. But so I think that's super important. And as the church continues to need to engage this, because I've seen it. I live in Omaha, Nebraska, so we're in a red state, but that I've told people all over, if we think we're insulated in this day and age, you can homeschool your kids, you can do all those things. These things are going to eke their way into the way people think because of the society in which we live. We're all connected in such an amazing way, but sometimes a problematic way as well. So what would be something that you would want to leave readers with and churches with this book? What are you hoping to accomplish? Maybe accomplish isn't the right term. What would you hope people would take from it and use with their Christian walk, if we're talking to Christians in their local churches?
I think the main thing we're aiming for in the book is promoting unity in the church. That's our main goal. Now, we do that through rejecting these theories that are ultimately corrosive and dangerous, but we're not merely doing that. The goal is always to live out God's commands to love one another, to seek the unity of the church, to be a witness to the world. So I want to emphasize that readers, when they step outside of this book, would take away the fact that we're not merely telling them what to be against, we're telling them what to be for. How do we approach issues of race, gender, class, poverty, justice as Christians based on what the Bible says? That's what we want people to walk away with. And then the other thing I would just say is that, one other thing I'd say is, just please get this book, read this book, give it to your pastor. It's so important. And we're not saying that because we're trying to sell the book. We just really believe that these ideas are so pernicious. We need to equip ourselves right now, yesterday, to combat this ideology. And the final thing is also just prayer, that this is a spiritual battle. Well, we have spiritual enemies it's always been trying to destroy Christians and destroy the church. So it can't merely be an intellectual thing. We have to get on our knees and pray for the church's unity and witness, and for us to get our act together and get rid of these false and dangerous ideas. But prayer is a big part of that.
Yeah, thanks for that. One of the things that I want to highlight there as we close is the fact that I think the reason some of these things are so attractive, and I appreciated the fact that you brought out why it's so attractive to people and can be misleading to pastors who want to love their congregants, is that the initial verbiage used in critical theory, critical race theory, it's no one wants to be called a bigot or a homophobe or a racist, because we're supposed to exhibit the love of Christ. And so since it starts to change the definition of what love is, it starts to change some of those definitions. I think I've seen personally friends who have started down that road saying, well, if this is what love is, then we've got to preach this, because I don't want to, I'm supposed to live with a good reputation to outsiders. And I'm having a bad reputation if I don't believe this. And so I need to start to augment my theology. And that's the exact backwards way to look at it. And I think you guys do a great job in your book of promoting that. I want to say once again, for those who don't have it, get it. I agree. I'll if you don't want to, I'll say buy it. I think it's good. Support it. It's Critical Dilemma. It's a great book. It's an important book. In fact, I'm going to be giving one to our pastor at our church as well. And say, hey, let's as a staff, I think it's important to go through this. It is 500 pages. I think it's easy to read, but it's time consuming. So don't just speed read through it. Actually take the time to read it. Gentlemen, thank you so much for, we went a little bit over our allotted time, but thank you so much for taking the time to talk about the book, to talk about these ideas. I think they're super important. Before we leave, is there anything by way of just one more parting shot, or where can we find some of your work other than the book?
Well, Neil has a fantastic website, Shenvi Apologetics. So I'll go ahead and plug that. And we're certainly on Twitter at Neil Shenvi and then at Real Pat Sawyer. And I would mention we haven't talked about queer theory in our conversation. And so queer theory is really coming in terms of what's happening in our current modern day, what's happening in the current zeitgeist of the cultural concerns that are really pressing in not only into the church, but also larger society. This book speaks to societal implications as well. So if you are not a Christian, but listening to this program, this book is certainly still for you. We try to make sure that we're covering some important things relative to general society as well. But our chapters on queer theory, I think, are very helpful, and it's very prescient in terms of our modern moment. And then I would also mention that we do put forth a plan. Neil has mentioned that we're not just trying to tear things down, but we're offering a positive vision for society. And we do that in terms of a 3-point plan in terms of promoting racial healing and racial unity. And there's been a couple of readers that have reached out to me through social media who have particularly, Josh, appreciated that dynamic, that us moving the ball forward in terms of racial unity and racial healing. So hopefully that'll be a bright spot for those who are reading this book as well.
Yeah, I think that's so important because a lot of times we can critique and then we just stop there and we don't say there's a discipleship path forward for the church in a cultural moment. And yeah, that's super important and important in your book as well. Neil, you want to add anything as far as where to go to find you, or any parting shots?
The book's website is criticaldilemma.com. You can see endorsements. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles. Christianbook.com has it, so any of those places you can buy it, and you can see your endorsements and book trailers, like that. So criticaldilemma.com probably is the best place to go to get more information.
Yeah. And then Forward by Carl Trueman, which was one of my favorite books, has been The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And I've been telling people, if you read Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and then you read Critical Dilemma, you're going to be equipped in a lot of ways to deal with what's going on in the culture. Because I think this builds, because Carl doesn't do the path forward necessarily in The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, but I think Critical Dilemma helps to build that bridge. So really appreciate that work. Along with that, before I let you go, Carl Trueman wrote, I think it's Strange New World, kind of a popular version. Some people have asked me, or have you guys considered condensing it and making kind of a popularized version of Critical Dilemma? Or
it's in the works, but tell them to man up and read the full book. Come on, guys. I mean, if you can read Rise and Triumph, you can read this book.
That's exactly right.
And there's an Audible version now. There's an audiobook version. So you don't want to read it, you can just put it on your headphones and listen. So,
all right. Yeah, I'll definitely tell them that. Well, thank you again, gentlemen. Really appreciate your time. God bless. And as always, as we say at FreeThinking Ministries, stay reasonable.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. All right. Once again, thank you so much, Neil and Pat, for joining us today. That's about all we have at Free Thinking Monthly for this month. Please like, share, and subscribe. Share this. This is a great interview. We didn't even tackle everything that's in this book. Again, Critical Dilemma by Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer. Please take a look at what they've written. We didn't get into a ton of stuff. There's other stuff that I have marked here. You can see all my sticky notes that are sticking out. We didn't get into how to move forward. We didn't get into a lot of different things that are actually in the book. So if you think that that interview does justice to what they actually unpack in the book, it did for the most part. But there's so much more where that came from, and so we encourage you to purchase the book. Amazon, we'll put a link to it in the description as well. Be sure to go to shenviapologetics.com. He's got so much good stuff there as well, and follow them on Twitter. I just want to say that this is an important point, inflection point, as some people say, in church history, especially in the American church, and it's important for us to actually recognize that and really really engage with these things with integrity and with good resources. And this is a great resource. You can check out our other things on FT Monthly. You can check out our other videos. Like, share, and subscribe this video. As always, subscribe to the channel. We would love to see you. Also, follow us on social media. We're on X or Twitter. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. Got lots of stuff coming out. We're so excited for what God is doing in Free Thinking Ministries, but we can only do it with the support of people like you as well. If you want to give to Free Thinking Ministries, that link is also in the description. You go to the donate page. You can give us a little bit of money so that we can continue to do interviews like this. We continue to glorify God with how we interact with the culture. And as always, we can continue to stay reasonable. God bless. See you next time.